They weren't the fastest jets in the sky. They didn't carry the heaviest payload. And yet, they won. Against all odds, dotting the cold skies over the South Atlantic in 1982, Britain's Royal Navy deployed a fighter jet unlike any other on Earth, the Harrier, a subsonic aircraft mocked by some as a jump jet toy. It would soon become the deadliest threat to Argentina's faster supersonic fleet. How? Because speed isn't everything in war. Agility, surprise, precision. That's what counts. When survival hangs in the balance, this is the untold story of how the Harrier, with its revolutionary vertical, short takeoff and landing, VTOL design, turned the tide in one of the 20th century's strangest and most sudden wars. A war waged thousands of miles from home, over a remote cluster of windswept islands most of the world had never heard of, but the Falklands. War wasn't just a colonial footnote. It was a defining moment in modern aerial warfare. In an age still dominated by brute speed and sheer firepower, the British Harrier proved that a nimble, adaptable aircraft, flown by elite pilots, could outfight and outthink superior numbers. This documentary dives deep into the geopolitical flashpoint that sparked the conflict, the desperate early days of the British Naval Task Force, the fierce dogfights over San Carlos water, and how a handful of Harriers managed to take down wave after wave of Argentine Mirages, Daggers, and Skyhawks. We'll explore the pioneering design of the Harrier, its roots in Cold War experimentation, and how it became Britain's ace in the sky when no other air force could reach that battlefield in time. And ultimately, we'll ask, what lessons did the world learn from the Harrier's victory? And could we be entering a new era where flexibility once again beats raw force? This is not just about jets. It's about how the underestimated can outfly the unbeatable. The Falklands War didn't begin in the skies. It began with a century-old territorial dispute that suddenly reignited into a full-blown conflict. The Falkland Islands, or Islas Malvinas, as Argentina calls them, have been under British control since 1833, but Argentina had long claimed sovereignty, calling the British presence an act of colonial theft. For decades, the dispute simmered diplomatically until 1982. Facing economic collapse and rising unrest at home, Argentina's military junta saw an opportunity to unite the nation with a bold distraction: reclaim the islands by force. On April 2nd, Argentine troops landed on the Falklands and seized control. To many, it seemed like a swift, one-sided affair, but they had miscalculated, half a world away. The British government, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, made a fateful decision: retake the islands by military force. Within days, a naval task force was launched, sailing 8,000 miles south. But Britain faced a logistical nightmare. No nearby bases, no airstrips, no ground presence, just open ocean and enemy-controlled skies. This made one thing clear: air superiority wouldn't be optional. It would be critical. The Royal Air Force's long-range bombers were nearly useless without support bases. The only viable solution? A small fleet of Sea Harriers, flown from the decks of aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. It was a gamble. The Harriers were few. The enemy was many. Argentina had dozens of fast jets. Mirage II is Dagger fighters, A4 Skyhawks, all flying from mainland bases just a few hundred miles away. And yet, the Harriers were Britain's only hope to keep ships, troops, and supplies alive during the landing operation. Thus, air power became the linchpin of the entire British campaign. And a subsonic jump jet, originally designed for cold war defense in Europe, was about to face its ultimate test. Over a windswept archipelago thousands of miles from home, to understand how Britain outmaneuvered faster Argentine jets, we need to look at the machine at the heart of the conflict, the Harrier. At first glance, the Hawker Siddeley Harrier was an unlikely warplane. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't fast, and it certainly wasn't intimidating like a supersonic fighter. But what it had was revolutionary: VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing. This made it the world's first operational jump jet. Born in the 1960s, the Harrier was designed for NATO's Cold War nightmare, a Soviet strike that would wipe out conventional runways. The solution? A fighter that could lift off from roads, forest clearings, or makeshift pads. It didn't need a runway, just open space. By 1982, the Royal Navy had adapted this design for carrier operations. The Sea Harrier variant could launch from smaller carriers, refuel midter, and carry cutting-edge air-to-air missiles, AIM-9L Sidewinders. These weren't just any Sidewinders. The AIM-9L was an all-aspect missile, capable of locking onto targets from any angle, including head-on. That gave the Harrier a brutal edge in close combat. But the real genius was tactical. The Harrier's superb maneuverability allowed it to engage in dogfights where speed wasn't everything. Its thrust vectoring nozzles could redirect jet flow mid-flight, allowing it to pivot, stop midder, or suddenly climb, tricks that confounded enemy pilots trained for textbook. High-speed engagements. Argentine jets like the Mirage 3 were faster, no doubt. But they were designed for high-altitude interception, not agile dogfights at low altitude over the sea. And they were hamstrung by logistics. With no aerial refueling, they had just minutes of combat time before needing to return to the mainland. That meant little time to engage, even less to pursue. The Sea Harriers, by contrast, had their carriers just offshore. They could loiter longer, react faster, and return quicker. And with British pilots trained for aggressive, close-quarter tactics, the Harrier wasn't just surviving. It was dominating. This wasn't just a clever design. It was a lesson. Agility, range, and brains could outclass raw speed when wielded by the right machine in the right hands. It began as a wild ambition, vertical flight from a combat jet. Not a helicopter, not some science fiction experiment, but a supersonic-capable aircraft that could lift off and land from places no airstrip could reach. A flying machine that didn't need a runway to rule the skies. The journey to the Harrier wasn't linear. It was turbulent, unconventional, and very, very British. Let's rewind to the 1950s. Post-World War II, Britain was facing the brutal realities of shrinking budgets, rising Cold War threats, and the need to project power globally without the luxury of giant aircraft carriers or massive air bases. Jet aircraft were evolving fast, becoming faster, sleeker, and more expensive. But in the shadows, engineers were quietly tinkering with an idea that could rewrite the rulebook. Most dismissed it. The Americans, Russians, and even NATO partners believed in bigger, better runways and faster interceptors. But in Britain, engineers at Bristol Siddeley developed something unique: the Pegasus engine, a jet turbine that could vector its thrust through rotating nozzles. Instead of pushing air backward, it could push it down, or in any direction needed. It was the missing puzzle piece. Enter Hawker Aircraft under the leadership of visionary designer Sir Sidney Cam and test pilot Bill Bedford. In 1960, they flew the P-127, a squat experimental prototype that amazed onlookers by lifting off vertically, hovering like a UFO, then transitioning to forward flight. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't fast. But it worked. That prototype evolved into the Kestrel, a more refined demonstrator tested by a tri-national team from the UK, US, and West Germany. Its success caught Washington's eye. But while the Americans admired the idea, they didn't fully commit. Britain did that by the late 1960s. The P-1127 and Kestrel had matured into something astonishing: the Harrier GR.1, the world's first operational VTOL fighter. It wasn't just a tech demo anymore. It was a weapon. While the Royal Air Force adopted it for tactical strike missions, it was the Royal Navy that saw its true value. Britain was phasing out its large aircraft carriers, too expensive to maintain in peacetime. But with Harriers, Smaller ships could suddenly launch strike aircraft without the need for catapults or arrestor wires. This created the revolutionary concept of the through-deck cruiser, a light carrier in disguise. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. Marine Corps had taken a keen interest. The Marines needed close air support for beach assaults and jungle warfare, often in places where conventional runways were suicide targets. In the Harrier, they found their match. By the early 1970s, they introduced the AV-8A Harrier, the Americanized version, into service. So by the time the 1980s arrived, the Harrier was no longer a novelty. It was a globally deployed warplane. But many still question its true combat value. It was slower than most jets. It carried less payload. And in a dogfight, many doubted it could hold its own. Then came 1982. The Falklands War became the Harrier's crucible. Its moment of reckoning. Argentina had seized the Falkland Islands, launching Britain into a desperate naval campaign 8,000 miles from home. The Royal Navy sailed without traditional carriers, just two small vessels, UAS Hermes and HMS Invincible, both carrying squadrons of Sea Harriers. These aircraft were modified for naval operations, fitted with radar and Sidewinder missiles. But in raw performance, they were still outmatched. Argentina flew Mirage 3 and Dagger fighters, faster, higher-flying, supersonic jets with better acceleration. But in real combat, speed alone wasn't enough. The Sea Harriers leveraged their VTOL agility for tight turns and surprise angles. They could pop up from sea level, use vertical thrust to outmaneuver, and operate in stormy conditions that grounded Argentine planes. Most importantly, they used their Blue Fox radar and AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles, all aspect seekers that could kill from any direction. The Harriers didn't just survive. They dominated by the end of the conflict. British Harriers had shot down over 20 Argentine aircraft with 0 air-to-air losses. They proved that agility, positioning, and pilot skill could defeat raw speed. More than that, they proved that VTOL wasn't just viable, it was superior in the right hands. After the war, interest in the Harriers surged. Lessons from the Falklands influenced global thinking on naval aviation and power projection. The U.S. Marines doubled down, commissioning the AV-8B Harrier II, co-developed with McDonnell Douglas, with improved avionics, a more powerful Pegasus engine, and greater payload capacity. Britain followed suit with the Harrier GR.5 and GR.7, modernized variants that incorporated night vision, precision-guided weapons, and digital cockpit systems. By the 1990s, Harriers were flying missions over Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, dropping laser-guided bombs and supporting troops in harsh, remote environments. But the evolutionary chain didn't stop there. The Harrier's combat performance laid the philosophical groundwork for a whole new generation of fighters. It directly influenced the vertical lift requirements in the Joint Strike Fighter program, leading to the development of the F-35B Lightning II, a stealth, supersonic jet with short takeoff and vertical landing capabilities. When the UK retired its last Harriers in 2010, many mourned the end of an era. But their DNA lives on in the decks of HMS Queen Elizabeth and in every F-35B that roars skyward from a ship too small to launch traditional jets. What began as an experimental curiosity in a small British hangar became one of the most consequential air power revolutions of the 20th century. The Harrier didn't just fly, it broke the rules. And in doing so, it proved that sometimes victory doesn't belong to the fastest. It belongs to the cleverest. The Sea Harrier wasn't the fastest jet in the South Atlantic, not by a long shot. But in the Falklands War, it wasn't speed that won the day. It was adaptability, precision, and sheer pilot skill. The British task force had one major vulnerability: the ships. Without land-based airfields, the entire campaign depended on naval supply lines, floating targets in an ocean swarming with Argentine aircraft. Every ship lost meant a potential collapse of the operation. That's where the Sea Harriers came in, flying from the decks of HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. These compact fighters quickly earned the nickname the Black Death from Argentine. Pilots, armed with a IM-9L Sidewinder missiles, a heat-seeking weapon far superior to Argentina's older models, the Harriers had a critical edge. The IM-9L could lock on from any angle, not just the rear, turning dogfights into deadly ambush, but the real revolution was vertical. The Harriers' VTOL, vertical short takeoff and landing, design allowed it to operate in tight conditions and gave it unmatched maneuverability in combat. Pilots could execute rapid climbs, tight turns, and hovering tactics that no conventional jet could match. In the Falklands' harsh, unpredictable weather, this agility proved invaluable. Still, they were outnumbered. Argentine Mirages and Daggers could fly faster and had more range. But British pilots, many of whom were Fleet Air Arm veterans, adapted quickly. They exploited cloud cover, used radar vectors from Royal Navy destroyers, and launched ambush at low altitude to conserve fuel and avoid radar. The results were staggering. Over the course of the war, Sea Harriers shot down 20 enemy aircraft. Without a single loss in air-to-air combat, an extraordinary kill ratio. They protected the fleet, suppressed enemy air raids, and supported ground operations during the critical landings at San Carlos Bay, a zone so dangerous it was nicknamed Bomb Alley. And yet, the Sea Harriers weren't just defensive tools. They carried out ground attack missions, striking radar installations, troop convoys, and artillery positions, often in poor visibility and under enemy fire. Their versatility turned them into the backbone of the British air campaign. By the time the Argentines realized how effective the Sea Harriers were, it was too late. Their tactics had been blunted, their morale shaken, and their offensive reach crippled. Britain's subsonic jump jets had turned the tide of the war, not by being faster, but by being smarter. Though the Falklands War ended in 1982, the legend of the Harrier lived on, not just in British hangars but in military doctrines around the world. The war had proven something revolutionary, that air superiority didn't depend solely on speed, stealth, or numbers. It could be won through agility, tactics, and the right machine in the right place. After the war, the Sea Harrier's reputation soared. Pilots who had flown it became instructors, shaping the next generation of naval aviators. Defense analysts from NATO allies poured over the Falklands combat data. One lesson stood out above all. VTOL worked, and in certain conditions, it was unbeatable. The Royal Navy invested heavily in improving the Harrier platform. Upgrades to radar, avionics, and weapon systems followed. The Sea Harrier FA-2, with its Blue Vixen radar and AMRAAM missiles, was a direct result of Falklands combat experience. It was smarter, deadlier, and more suited to modern threats. The aircraft remained in service until 2006. But the Harrier's impact didn't stop there. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Marine Corps had already adopted the AV-8B Harrier II. The Falklands' experience validated their strategy of using Harriers for close air support in austere, forward-deployed environments. The Harrier II became a key asset in conflicts from the Gulf War to Afghanistan. Its ability to take off from makeshift airstrips or amphibious assault ships gave Marines firepower in places traditional jets couldn't reach. In many ways, the Falklands became a case study in asymmetric air power. It influenced not only jet design, but fleet composition, carrier strategy, and joint operations planning. Countries with limited resources or smaller carriers began to rethink what air power meant. You didn't need a supercarrier. You needed a flexible air wing. Even the F-35B Lightning II, the world's first supersonic stealth jet with vertical landing capability, owes part of its lineage to the Harrier. Its development was shaped by decades of VTOL lessons, with engineers refining the Harrier's concept for a new century. And yet, despite its fame, the Harrier wasn't invincible. It had limitations in range, payload, and maintenance demands. Flying them was as much an art as a science. But in the hands of skilled pilots, during a war that should have been dominated by faster, newer aircraft, the Harrier had changed the rules. The Falklands War gave it a proving ground, and the Harrier delivered beyond all expectations. Long after it left service, its legacy continues to shape how nations think about flexible, forward-based air power. The Harrier's victories in the Falklands weren't just tactical, they were symbolic. A subsonic jet, dismissed by some as obsolete, had outmaneuvered and outfought faster, newer aircraft. That shook assumptions, not just in Buenos Aires or London, but in every military command center from Washington to Moscow. Strategists took notice. The idea that a warplane could operate without runways, from makeshift pads, roads, or tiny carriers, suddenly seemed not just viable, but vital. In an era of satellite-guided missiles and first-strike doctrines, survivability mattered. More than ever, the Harrier proved that flexibility wasn't a luxury. It was a force multiplier. Its influence rippled across global militaries. India and Spain expanded their use of VTOL aircraft. The US Marines doubled down on their Harrier program, leading to enhancements in vertical thrust, cockpit visibility, and safety protocols. Other countries, even those with limited defense budgets, began experimenting with dispersed airfields and STOVL-capable drones. The Harrier also rewrote the cultural script of air combat. For the first time since World War II, dogfighting was back in the spotlight, not as a relic, but as a tactical necessity. Harrier pilots were suddenly seen not just as aviators, but as knife fighters in the sky, agile, daring, unpredictable. In British memory, the Falklands became a moment of national resolve. The Harrier, with its iconic hovering roar, became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that innovation, when paired with courage, could level any battlefield. Even decades later, documentaries, flight simulations, and air shows continue to honor the aircraft's role. Retired Harriers sit proudly in museums, but their legacy is far from static. Their DNA lives on in the F-35B, in naval strategy, and in every debate about what modern air power should look like. Perhaps the Harrier's greatest legacy isn't technical, but philosophical. It taught the world that warfare doesn't always favor the biggest, fastest, or flashiest tool. It favors the one best adapted to the mission. The Falklands gave us that lesson in cold, brutal clarity. And the Harrier, rising vertically into the gray South Atlantic sky, delivered it with precision. Though the Harrier has retired from frontline service in the UK, and the US is phasing it out, its spirit is far from grounded. Its design philosophy, vertical takeoff, short runway adaptability, and multi-role functionality lives on in. One of the most advanced aircraft ever built, the F-35B Lightning II. The F-35B isn't just a successor, it's a culmination. Designed with stealth, AI-assisted systems, sensor fusion, and STOVL capability, it can launch from assault ships or forward bases in contested zones, much like the Harrier once did. But it does more. It sees first, fires first, and often isn't seen at all. In the modern age, the Harrier's lessons have been absorbed and then amplified beyond the F-35B. Global defense trends continue to embrace agility over bulk. Nations are increasingly investing in dispersed operations, vertical lift capabilities, and VTOL drones. The urban battlefield of the future may not allow for long runways, but it will reward aircraft that can adapt, hover, strike, and vanish. Meanwhile, emerging technologies like directed energy weapons, swarming autonomous drones, and next-gen propulsion systems are reshaping what vertical combat might look like. Some defense labs are even exploring hybrid aircraft that combine fixed-wing performance with rotary lift, essentially supersonic Harrier-like platforms for the 21st century. The geopolitical map is also evolving. In the Indo-Pacific, where small islands could become flashpoints, STOVL aircraft offer unmatched flexibility. A single highway, a flat deck, or a hidden pad becomes an airbase. That's the tactical inheritance of the Harrier, warplanes untethered from the tyranny of runways. Yet, with rising costs, political friction, and the dawn of unmanned systems, there's debate. Will future vertical aircraft be piloted at all? Or will Harrier's true heir be a stealthy VTOL-capable drone, agile, cheap, and expendable? What's clear is this: the Falklands didn't just validate the Harrier. They validated an idea that in war it's not just the machine that matters, but how quickly it can adapt to chaos. From that perspective, the Harrier wasn't just ahead of its time, it defined what time would become. The story of the Harrier isn't just a chapter in aviation history. It's a lesson in innovation, risk, and triumph under pressure. In 1982, against faster, more numerous enemies, the Harrier defied expectations. It soared vertically from ships, fought fiercely in the skies, and helped turn the tide of the Falklands War. But more than that, it shattered the myth that speed alone wins air battles. Maneuverability, flexibility, pilot skill, and strategy proved decisive. From its Cold War origins to its battlefield legacy, the Harrier became more than a machine. It was a symbol of daring British engineering and battlefield adaptability. It flew from the seas, operated from rough fields, and struck where no one expected. Its DNA lives on today in the F-35B, in VTOL drones, in every military doctrine that prizes agility over size. The Harrier showed that with the right technology, even a small force can punch far above its weight. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about aerial warfare, if it opened your eyes to the hidden edge that changed the war, then here's what you can do next. Like this video, share it with fellow history and aviation enthusiasts. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dive documentaries that expose the game changers in military history. And if you think the Harrier's journey was remarkable, wait until you see what's next. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about why it still matters.